Our joint savings account went from just under $200,000 to $11.40 over the course of 6 weeks, in a series of transfers I never authorized, made through phone calls to our bank that our bank's own records show were verified, each time, using my voice. I never made those calls. I was at work, or asleep, or sitting in the same room as my husband, Daniel, having no idea that somewhere, on a device I never saw, a synthetic version of my own voice was speaking to a bank representative, answering security questions, authorizing transfers, dismantling a decade of shared savings one call at a time. My name is Rachel. I'm 39 years old, and 3 months ago, I discovered that my husband had spent nearly 2 months secretly draining our joint accounts using AI-generated audio built from years of my own voicemails and recorded video calls, timed, I would eventually learn, to finish just days before he filed for divorce, ensuring that by the time I was served with papers, there would be almost nothing left in our shared accounts for a court to actually divide. This is the story of how I discovered a synthetic version of my own voice had been used against me, what it took to prove it wasn't actually me on those recorded bank calls, and the specific, cold calculation behind exactly why he chose this particular method, and this particular timeline, to do it. I need to tell you about the months leading up to this discovery, because the actual context matters enormously to understanding how something this elaborate went unnoticed for as long as it did. Daniel and I had been married for 11 years, and by the final year of our marriage, we both understood, in the quiet, unspoken way long married couples sometimes do, that things weren't working anymore. We drifted, the way people sometimes drift, into a marriage that functioned adequately on the surface while feeling increasingly hollow underneath. We discussed separating. In general terms, on a handful of occasions over the preceding several months, conversations that felt sad but not acrimonious, the kind of ending that seemed, at the time, likely to be difficult but fundamentally civil. I want to be honest that I had no reason, during that period, to suspect Daniel of anything approaching what he was actually doing. If anything, his behavior in those final months struck me as unusually calm and accommodating, a quality I now understand, with painful hindsight, was likely the specific, practiced patience of someone executing a careful plan rather than someone simply working through an amicable separation alongside me. Daniel worked in commercial real estate, a field that had exposed him, over the years, to a considerable amount of information about asset protection and financial structuring, knowledge I'd always understood as simply professional expertise relevant to his clients' transactions. I had no idea, until considerably later, how directly that same professional knowledge would eventually inform decisions he made about our own marriage's dissolution. I remember, specifically, a conversation roughly 2 months before I discovered any of this, where Daniel and I sat at our kitchen table discussing, in fairly calm, practical terms, what a separation might actually look like, who would keep the house, how we might divide our savings, the kind of logistical conversation two people nearing the end of a marriage sometimes manage to have without excessive bitterness. I remember feeling, at the time, a strange kind of gratitude that we seemed capable of approaching something this painful with genuine civility. I understand now that conversation likely happened after Daniel had already begun the process I'd eventually discover, meaning the calm, reasonable tone I found so reassuring may have simply reflected a man who already knew, with considerable confidence, that the actual financial stakes of our upcoming divorce would look very different than whatever I believed we were calmly discussing. I want to describe something specific about our marriage's final year that only became significant to me in hindsight, the sheer volume of recorded video calls Daniel and I had accumulated, entirely innocently, over that period, and how that mundane archive ended up mattering enormously to everything that followed. Daniel had traveled extensively for work during that final year, sometimes 2 or 3 trips a month, and we developed a habit, like many couples navigating that kind of travel schedule, of video calling most evenings he was away rather than simply texting. Neither of us had any particular reason to think about where those calls were being stored, or who might eventually have access to them beyond the two of us. They were simply an ordinary, unremarkable part of staying connected during a difficult stretch of business travel. I would later learn, once Priya's forensic investigation was underway, that this exact archive, dozens of hours of clear, high-quality recorded video calls, capturing my voice extensively across a wide range of natural conversational contexts, represented precisely the kind of rich, varied training material a voice cloning tool would need to produce a genuinely convincing result. What felt, at the time, like an ordinary byproduct of a difficult travel schedule had, without my knowledge, become the exact raw material eventually used against me. The first sign something was wrong arrived in the form of a customer service call I made to our bank, roughly 2 months before I understood the actual scope of what had happened, regarding an entirely unrelated matter, a question about setting up automatic bill pay for a new utility account. The representative I spoke with, partway through our call, mentioned, almost in passing, that she saw I'd called yesterday evening about updating my mailing address on the account, a call I had absolutely no memory of making. I told her, confused, that I hadn't called the previous evening at all. She checked her notes again and confirmed the call had come from the number on file, verified through our standard voice authentication process, requesting a mailing address change that had, in fact, already been processed. I remember feeling genuinely disoriented by that exchange rather than immediately alarmed, assuming, at the time, some kind of administrative error or perhaps confusion about which specific account she was referencing. I asked her to reverse the mailing address change, which she did without much difficulty, and I hung up the phone still mostly convinced this was some kind of clerical mix-up rather than anything more serious. It was nearly 3 weeks later, checking our joint savings account balance for an entirely unrelated reason, that I noticed the number displayed on my banking app didn't match what I remembered it should be. Not by a small amount. By tens of thousands of dollars. That I called the bank immediately, genuinely alarmed at that point, and spent nearly 2 hours on the phone working through a transaction history that made increasingly little sense the further back I traced it. Over the preceding 6 weeks, according to the bank's own records, a series of substantial transfers had moved out of our joint savings account, most of them routed to an external account I didn't recognize at all, authorized through a combination of online banking access and, in several instances, direct phone calls to the bank's customer service line, calls the bank's own voice authentication system had verified as coming from me, based on VoicePrint matching against my previously enrolled voice sample. I want to describe the specific, disorienting quality of hearing that explanation, because it initially made no logical sense to me at all. I hadn't made any of those calls. I had no memory of authorizing any of these transfers. And yet the bank was telling me, with genuine confidence in their own security systems, that their voice authentication technology had confirmed, each time, that it was speaking with me. The representative I eventually escalated to, a fraud specialist named Carlos, was the first person to take my confusion seriously as something beyond a simple misunderstanding. He pulled the actual audio recordings of the calls in question, standard practice for any account under fraud review, and offered to have me listen to them directly, since I clearly had no memory of any of these interactions actually taking place. Carlos walked me, patiently, through the actual mechanics of the transfers themselves before we even got to the recordings, and the picture he described was considerably more sophisticated than I'd initially imagined. Rather than a single large withdrawal that might have triggered an automatic fraud alert, the transfers had been structured as a series of moderate, individually unremarkable amounts, spaced out across 6 weeks, each one falling comfortably under the threshold that would have prompted our bank's automated systems to flag unusual activity for manual review. Whoever had planned this, Carlos noted, clearly understood exactly how those automated thresholds worked, and had deliberately structured the theft to stay beneath them. I want to describe the specific, genuinely unsettling experience of listening to those recordings for the first time, because I don't think I've ever felt anything quite like it before or since. It was my voice. Not an approximation, not something that sounded vaguely similar, my actual voice, my specific inflections, small verbal habits I wasn't even fully conscious I had until I heard them played back to me from a call I had never made. The voice on those recordings answered security questions correctly, discussed the reasons for the transfers in casual, plausible-sounding detail, consolidating some funds for a home renovation project. One call explained, in my voice, with my exact conversational rhythm, and thanked the representative warmly at the end of each call, the way I genuinely do, out of habit, on ordinary customer service calls. Carlos played 3 separate calls for me that afternoon, each one representing a different transfer, and I remember asking him to pause partway through the second one, needing a moment simply to breathe before continuing. There's a specific, visceral wrongness to hearing your own voice say something you never said, discuss financial decisions you never made, in a tone so accurate it momentarily overrides your own certainty that you weren't actually the one speaking. For a strange, fleeting second during that second recording, I found myself almost doubting my own memory, wondering, absurdly, whether I'd somehow made these calls in some state I couldn't recall. That specific, brief self-doubt frightened me almost as much as the fraud itself once I recognized what was happening. This technology hadn't just stolen money. It had, for one disorienting moment, made me question my own certainty about my own actions. Carlos, to his credit, was the one who first raised the possibility I hadn't yet considered myself, still reeling from simply hearing my own voice say things I'd never said. He mentioned, carefully, that the bank's fraud department had, over the preceding year, begun seeing an increasing number of cases involving what he described as synthetic voice fraud, AI-generated audio convincing enough to defeat voice authentication systems that had, until fairly recently, been considered a genuinely secure verification method. I sat with that possibility for a long moment, turning it over, before the actual, cold clarity of what he was suggesting fully landed. Someone had built a synthetic version of my voice, convincing enough to fool a bank's own security technology, and had used it, repeatedly, over 6 weeks, to drain our shared savings. I asked Carlos, somewhat desperately, whether there was any way to simply undo the transfers once fraud had been confirmed, some kind of automatic reversal process banks could initiate once a case like this was identified. He explained, gently, that unfortunately the process was rarely that simple. Funds moved to external accounts, particularly across multiple hops through different institutions, often become considerably harder to trace and recover the longer they've had to move, and that our best path forward would likely require a combination of the bank's own internal fraud investigation and, depending on what that investigation uncovered, involvement from law enforcement and my own independent legal counsel. That was the specific moment I understood this had already moved well beyond something the bank alone could simply fix for me. Once I understood, at least in broad terms, what had actually happened, the obvious, devastating next question became who could possibly have had both the motive and the raw material necessary to build something this convincing. I want to be honest that I arrived at Daniel as a suspect only reluctantly, after first working through, and ultimately dismissing, several other, less painful possibilities. I considered whether this might be a broader, automated fraud scheme entirely unconnected to anyone in my personal life, the kind of thing that happens to strangers on the news. Carlos gently but clearly explained why that explanation didn't fit the pattern he was seeing in our case specifically. The transfers had required detailed, accurate personal knowledge about our specific accounts, our specific financial habits, information a random, opportunistic scammer targeting strangers wouldn't typically have access to at all. I thought, with a growing, reluctant dread, about the raw materials something like this would actually require: a substantial amount of clear, high-quality recorded audio of my voice, enough for whatever technology was involved to build a convincing model. And I realized, sitting with that specific requirement, that very few people in my life had access to that kind of audio at all. Years of voicemails I'd left Daniel. Countless recorded video calls during a period he'd traveled frequently for work. My own voice, captured extensively, over more than a decade of marriage, by the one person who'd had more continuous, intimate access to it than anyone else in my life. I didn't want to believe it. I want to be honest about that specific reluctance, because I think it's an important, human part of this story. Even holding genuine, mounting suspicion, some part of me actively resisted the conclusion that the man I'd shared 11 years with was capable of something this calculated and cold. I remember calling my sister that same evening, working through my suspicions out loud with her for the first time, and she asked me a question that ended up mattering considerably to how I approached everything that followed. She asked whether Daniel had access to any professional resources or connections that might explain how he'd learned to use technology this specialized, given that voice cloning wasn't exactly common knowledge for most ordinary people. I told her about a conversation I vaguely remembered him having, months earlier, with a colleague who worked in some kind of technology consulting on the side, a conversation I'd barely registered at the time as anything beyond ordinary professional small talk. That memory, once I actually sat with it directly, took on a considerably more significant weight than it had ever carried before. I retained an attorney the following week, a careful, methodical practitioner named Vanessa Kim who specialized in both family law and financial fraud, an unusually specific combination of expertise that turned out to be exactly what my situation required. Vanessa explained, in our first consultation, that what I was describing sat at the intersection of two separate, serious legal categories: potential wire fraud and computer fraud under federal law, given that funds had moved across state lines through fraudulently authorized banking transactions, and potential marital asset dissipation under family law, given that Daniel had, if my suspicion proved correct, systematically drained shared marital assets in the immediate lead-up to filing for divorce, timing that Vanessa said courts take extremely seriously when dividing marital property. She connected me with a digital forensic specialist, a careful analyst named Priya who specialized in audio authentication and synthetic media detection, work that had become increasingly relevant, she told me, as voice cloning technology had grown more accessible and more frequently implicated in exactly this kind of financial fraud. Vanessa was candid, in that same initial meeting, that this specific combination of circumstances, a marriage ending, substantial marital assets, and a technically sophisticated spouse with professional exposure to asset structuring, represented, in her professional experience, exactly the kind of profile most likely to produce this particular category of fraud, even though the specific use of AI voice cloning remained, at that point, still a genuinely novel wrinkle in a pattern of pre-divorce financial misconduct she'd otherwise seen in various forms throughout her career. Priya's analysis of the actual bank call recordings, conducted over several weeks, identified specific, technical artifacts in the audio, subtle, consistent irregularities in breath patterns and certain phoneme transitions, that she described as strong, though not yet fully court-tested, indicators of AI-generated synthetic speech rather than a genuine, live human voice. Priya's investigation also traced the likely source material for the clone, cross-referencing the synthetic voice's specific vocal characteristics against audio she was able to source, with my consent, from my own voicemail history and video call recordings, the exact kind of extensive, high-quality audio archive that, as I'd already begun to suspect, existed almost exclusively on devices and accounts Daniel had direct, ongoing access to throughout our marriage. That I want to spend a little more time on the specific technical process Priya used to build a case strong enough to eventually hold up in both criminal and civil proceedings, because I think the mechanics matter for understanding how something this seemingly futuristic actually gets proven in a courtroom. Priya explained that current synthetic voice detection relies on identifying specific, consistent technical artifacts that genuine human speech simply doesn't produce, subtle irregularities in breath timing, since AI-generated audio often struggles to convincingly replicate the natural, slightly irregular rhythm of human breathing during extended speech, along with certain phoneme transitions, the small connective sounds between words that current voice cloning technology, however advanced, still tends to render with a specific, detectable smoothness that differs from genuine, spontaneous human speech. She ran the actual bank call recordings through several independent analysis tools, cross-referencing their results against each other to build a more defensible, consistent finding rather than relying on any single method alone. She also compared the recordings directly against verified, authentic samples of my own voice, establishing a clear technical baseline that made the synthetic recording subtle deviations considerably easier to identify and document with confidence. The entire process, she told me, took nearly 3 weeks of careful, methodical work, precisely because she understood how much weight her eventual findings would need to carry in whatever legal proceedings followed. What transformed this from a devastating but still somewhat ambiguous financial mystery into a clear, deliberate case against Daniel specifically was the timeline Vanessa's office assembled once we had subpoena power to access broader records as part of the formal legal proceedings that followed. The first fraudulent transfer had occurred almost exactly 6 weeks before Daniel filed for divorce, a filing that, notably, he'd never discussed with me directly beforehand despite our general, ongoing conversations about the state of our marriage. I learned about the actual filing only once I was formally served with papers, an experience that landed very differently once I understood it had been preceded by 6 weeks of quiet, systematic asset removal. Vanessa's office subpoenaed records from a cloud storage service Daniel used for work, uncovering a folder, created roughly 2 months before the first fraudulent transfer, containing dozens of audio files clearly extracted and isolated from our shared voicemail history and video call recordings. My voice, cut into clean, individual segments, exactly the kind of organized raw material an AI voice cloning tool would require to build an accurate model. The folder's own metadata showed it had been actively modified and expanded across several weeks, precisely the time frame immediately preceding the first fraudulent bank call. I want to describe the specific, cold clarity that timeline produced once I finally saw the complete picture laid out in front of me. Daniel hadn't made an impulsive, isolated bad decision in a moment of desperation. He had spent weeks, methodically, building a technical tool specifically designed to defeat our bank's security systems, using my own voice as raw material, timed with clear, deliberate precision to finish extracting funds in the exact window before he intended to file for a divorce that would have, under normal circumstances, required those same funds to be fairly divided between us. Vanessa's office also uncovered a set of internet search records, obtained through the same subpoena process, showing Daniel had researched, during that same window, several specific topics that collectively painted an unmistakable picture of premeditation. Search queries about marital asset division laws in our state, about typical timelines for divorce filings, and, most damningly, several searches directly related to voice cloning software and its technical requirements, conducted in the days immediately before that cloud storage folder of extracted audio samples was first created. I remember Vanessa walking me through that specific search history in her office, watching her point to each date, each query, laying out a timeline so clearly deliberate that any remaining doubt I might have privately held about Daniel's intent simply evaporated entirely. That I confronted Daniel roughly 2 months after my initial discovery, once Vanessa and Priya had assembled sufficient documentation that I felt genuinely prepared for whatever explanation, or lack of one, he might offer. I met with him, alongside Vanessa, in a setting she'd carefully arranged given the ongoing legal proceedings already underway. I laid out the transaction records, the forensic audio analysis, and the cloud storage folder timeline, watching his composure shift through a sequence I've since heard Vanessa describe as fairly typical in cases involving this kind of sustained, deliberate deception. An initial, brief attempt at confusion or denial followed, once the sheer specificity of the evidence made that posture impossible to sustain, by a more genuine, if still deeply inadequate, explanation. I remember, specifically, the moment I placed the printed search history in front of him, watching him stare at it for what felt like a full minute without saying anything at all. Vanessa had warned me beforehand that this particular piece of evidence would likely be the hardest for him to explain away, since it demonstrated a level of premeditation considerably harder to reframe as impulsive desperation than the transfers themselves might have been on their own. Watching him search, visibly, for some remaining angle and clearly failing to find one was, in its own strange way, one of the more clarifying moments of the entire confrontation for me. He told me, eventually, that he'd become convinced, in the months leading up to our separation, that our marriage's assets would be divided unfairly against him in a divorce, a belief Vanessa later confirmed had no actual legal basis whatsoever given the straightforward nature of our marital finances, but that he'd apparently held with genuine, if misguided, conviction. He said he discovered voice cloning technology through, of all things, a work colleague discussing it in an unrelated context, and had spent weeks teaching himself how to use it, motivated by what he described as a need to protect what was mine, before a divorce process he'd convinced himself would unfairly strip him of everything. I asked him directly whether he'd understood, at any point across those weeks, that what he was actually doing constituted serious financial fraud, not some clever, defensible act of self-protection. He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he'd understood it, clearly, the entire time, and had simply decided the risk was worth it, believing, with what turned out to be considerable miscalculation, that the fraud itself would be difficult enough to trace back to him specifically, that he'd likely never face genuine consequences for it. I asked him one more question that afternoon, one I hadn't fully planned to ask but that emerged almost involuntarily once his initial explanation had run its course. I asked whether, during those 6 weeks, while he was extracting clips of my voice from years of our recorded calls, he had felt anything at all about what he was actually doing to me specifically, beyond the purely practical, financial calculation he kept returning to in his explanation. He was quiet again, longer this time, before saying that he'd told himself, repeatedly, that it wasn't personal, that it was simply a financial strategy, a framing I found almost more disturbing than open malice would have been, the specific, deliberate effort required to convince himself that using my own voice against me, for weeks, could ever be understood as something other than deeply, unmistakably personal. The legal process that followed unfolded across several distinct tracks, reflecting the genuinely unusual, multi-layered nature of what Daniel had actually done. The criminal case, built around the wire fraud and computer fraud violations, involved coordination between local law enforcement and federal investigators, given that the fraudulent transfers had crossed state lines through interstate banking systems, placing the case squarely within federal jurisdiction. Vanessa explained that cases involving this kind of clearly documented, deliberate synthetic media fraud were still relatively novel from a prosecutorial standpoint, but that the strength of our forensic evidence, the cloud storage folder, the technical audio analysis, the precise timeline correlation with the divorce filing, gave prosecutors an unusually strong, well-documented case to build from. Daniel ultimately entered a plea agreement on the criminal charges, receiving a sentence that included a period of incarceration alongside a formal restitution order, requiring him to repay the full amount fraudulently transferred, though Vanessa was candid that actual recovery of those funds would likely take considerable additional time and effort given how much of the money had already been moved through multiple accounts before the fraud was ultimately discovered. The federal investigators involved in the criminal case also traced the external account that had originally received the fraudulent transfers, discovering that Daniel had moved the funds through a rapid sequence of additional accounts and, in part, into cryptocurrency, a pattern the lead investigator described to me directly as a fairly common, if increasingly outdated, method people attempt to use to obscure the trail of stolen funds, one that ultimately proved traceable anyway through the specific combination of banking records, exchange records, and the digital forensics work Priya's office had already begun. That tracing effort, while ultimately successful in recovering a meaningful portion of the stolen funds, took nearly 8 additional months beyond the initial criminal case's resolution, a timeline that tested my patience considerably even after the legal questions themselves had been formally settled. The family law proceedings, running in parallel, addressed the marital asset dissipation directly. Vanessa successfully argued that the fraudulently transferred funds should be treated, for purposes of dividing our marital estate, as though they still existed in our joint accounts, entitling me to a considerably larger share of whatever assets remained, plus a formal, legally documented claim against Daniel's future earnings and any recovered funds, to account for the assets he deliberately, fraudulently removed from our marital estate in the immediate lead-up to filing for divorce. Vanessa explained the specific legal doctrine underlying this argument in more detail than I'd initially understood, something she called marital waste or dissipation of assets, a concept recognized in most states' family law that allows a court to effectively add back improperly removed marital funds when calculating a fair division of property, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of strategic, pre-divorce asset stripping Daniel had attempted. She noted that courts generally require clear, convincing evidence that funds were removed for a purpose unrelated to the marriage and without the other spouse's knowledge or consent, a standard our case met about as thoroughly as any she'd personally handled, given the sheer volume of direct, documented evidence Priya's forensic work and the subpoenaed search history had already established. That I want to spend some time on what I learned, more broadly, about voice cloning technology and its growing role in financial fraud, because I think it's genuinely important information beyond just my own specific situation. Priya explained to me, over the course of our work together, that the technology required to convincingly clone someone's voice has become dramatically more accessible over just the past few years, moving from something requiring specialized technical expertise and substantial computing resources to tools that are, in some cases, available to anyone willing to spend a modest amount of time learning to use them. She told me that financial institutions across the industry have been scrambling to adapt their voice authentication systems in response, though she was candid that the technology for detecting synthetic voice fraud, while improving, still generally lags behind the technology for actually creating it. I asked her, directly, what she would recommend to anyone concerned about this same kind of vulnerability in their own financial security. She suggested moving away from voice-only authentication wherever possible, toward multi-factor verification methods that require something beyond just a voice print, a physical security key, a time-sensitive code sent to a device, biometric verification beyond voice alone. She also suggested being more deliberate about how much raw, clear audio of your own voice exists across shared devices and cloud accounts, a suggestion that felt, given everything I'd just been through, both entirely reasonable and genuinely unsettling to fully absorb. Priya also shared something with me that I've found myself thinking about often since, a broader observation from her professional work that extended well beyond just my own specific case. She told me that the majority of synthetic voice fraud cases she'd worked on, across her career, involved a perpetrator with some form of prior intimate relationship or trusted access to the victim, rather than a random stranger targeting them, a pattern she said made a certain grim sense once you actually thought through the mechanics involved, since building a convincing voice clone requires exactly the kind of extensive, high-quality audio archive that typically only exists between people who've shared years of close, ongoing communication. That statistic reframed something for me. This wasn't some freak, isolated occurrence unique to my own unusual circumstances, but a documented, recognizable pattern specifically enabled by the intimate access closeness itself provides. I want to describe, briefly, the specific challenge of explaining this situation to friends and family, because the technical, unusual nature of what happened made it considerably harder to convey than more conventional forms of financial betrayal might have been. I found myself, more than once during those early conversations, having to explain the basic premise of voice cloning itself before I could even get to the actual details of what had happened to me specifically, a strange, exhausting extra layer most people telling more conventional betrayal stories don't typically have to navigate. Several people, entirely understandably, initially assumed I was describing something closer to identity theft in the more familiar sense, someone using my personal information, my social security number, my existing accounts, rather than the specific, unsettling reality that someone had built an entirely new, synthetic version of my own physical voice from scratch. My parents' first reaction, understandably, focused on the money itself and the divorce, categories of betrayal they already had some frame of reference for. It took several additional conversations for them to fully grasp the more specific, technically unusual mechanism involved, that Daniel hadn't simply stolen money in some ordinary way, but had built an actual synthetic replica of my own voice specifically to defeat security systems designed to protect me. Several friends, particularly those with technical backgrounds, understood the full implications considerably faster, several of them independently mentioning growing concerns they'd already been developing about voice cloning technology's potential for exactly this kind of misuse, concerns that had, until my own situation, remained largely theoretical and abstract to them. I found a strange, specific comfort in those conversations, understanding that what happened to me, however unusual and disorienting, connected to a genuinely significant, broader technological and legal reckoning already quietly underway. My own experience navigating this, difficult as it was, ended up leading to something I hadn't anticipated during the darkest weeks of the investigation, a connection with a small but growing informal network of people who'd experienced their own versions of synthetic media fraud. Connected initially through Priya's professional referrals and eventually through a support group she helped facilitate specifically for victims of this emerging category of crime. Sitting in a room, for the first time, with several other people who genuinely understood the specific, disorienting experience of hearing your own cloned voice used against you, rather than having to explain the entire premise from scratch to well-meaning friends who'd never encountered anything like it, provided a particular kind of relief I hadn't realized I needed until I actually experienced it. That I want to end with something a little more personal, before the broader closing thoughts. Because I think it captures the specific, lingering texture of this experience better than the legal resolution itself does. I still have every voicemail Daniel ever left me, still sitting in an old phone backup I haven't been able to bring myself to delete, and, in a strange, mirrored way, I still have the recordings the bank eventually released to me of my own cloned voice, authorizing transfers I never made. I've listened to both, occasionally, in the months since all of this concluded, and I've noticed something I didn't expect. The synthetic recordings, unsettling as they are, don't actually frighten me the way I assumed they might, the more distance I get from the initial discovery. What unsettles me more, if I'm honest, is simply hearing Daniel's actual, genuine voice on those old voicemails, warm and familiar in a way that no longer matches anything I understand to be true about who he actually is. I think that's the detail I'd most want anyone listening to sit with, more than the technical specifics of voice cloning or the legal mechanics of asset dissipation. The most disorienting part of a betrayal like this isn't usually the sophisticated, unfamiliar technology involved. It's the much older, much more familiar experience of realizing a voice you loved and trusted completely belonged to someone capable of something you never could have imagined, technology aside. I don't tell this story to suggest voice cloning technology itself is something to fear in every context, or that every spouse going through a divorce is secretly planning something similar. Most people, even in difficult, contentious separations, don't turn to anything remotely resembling what Daniel did. What happened in my marriage was the result of one specific person's deliberate, calculated decision to weaponize an emerging technology against the very person whose trust and cooperation he'd relied on for over a decade. If there's something practical I'd ask you to take from this, particularly as voice cloning technology becomes more accessible, it's this: understand your own financial institution's authentication methods, and don't assume voice-only verification is as secure as it once was. Ask your bank directly about multi-factor options beyond VoicePrint alone. And if you're going through a divorce or separation, however amicable it seems on the surface, it costs very little to independently monitor shared accounts closely during that period, rather than assuming good faith is sufficient protection on its own. I'd add one more piece of practical guidance, specific to anyone currently navigating a separation or divorce of their own, regardless of how amicable it currently feels. Consider requesting individual account statements directly from your financial institutions rather than relying solely on shared online access, and don't hesitate to place a temporary hold or additional verification requirement on joint accounts during a separation, even if it feels like an uncomfortable, mistrustful step to take with someone you've shared a life with. I understand, better than I ever wanted to, exactly how devastating the alternative can be. I got a legal acknowledgement that what happened to me was a serious, deliberate crime, not something I imagined or somehow failed to prevent through carelessness. I got a restitution order and a more favorable division of whatever marital assets remained. What I can't fully get back is the specific, unsettling knowledge that my own voice, the most basic, intimate marker of my own identity, was turned into a tool used against me by someone who had spent over a decade learning exactly how to sound convincing as me. I think, often, about the specific strangeness of continuing to use my own voice every single day, in ordinary conversations, fully aware now that a synthetic version of it exists, or existed, somewhere, built from years of recordings I never imagined would be used this way. I don't think that awareness has fundamentally changed how I speak or interact with people day to day, but it has changed, permanently, a small, quiet part of how I think about privacy and consent, even in contexts as seemingly mundane as an ordinary phone call to a person I love and trust completely. If this story affected you, or if you've ever discovered that something as fundamental as your own voice or identity was used in a way you never consented to, I want to hear about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. There are more of these stories, and more of what I've learned protecting myself in an increasingly digital world, every week.